This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Jarvis Givens, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies and School of Education at Harvard University. Along with a number of essays in popular and academic venues, he is co-editor of We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys from 2018, and author of Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching from 2021, School Clothes, a collective memoir of Black student witness from 2023, American Grammar, Race, Education, and the Building of a Nation from 2025, and I'll Make a World, the 100-year journey of Black History Month from 2026. In this conversation, we discuss the place of education and educational writing in African American history, the cultural and politics of Black study, and the imperative for Black studies to impact community educational spaces. Good morning, Jarvis. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing well. It's good to be here with you.
Well, I'm super excited that we've found time to get your voice on the podcast and have this conversation for a lot of reasons. I think your work is really interesting. I think it's urgent for the field of Black studies. It's urgent for anyone concerned with Black life broadly, but also narrowly in terms of questions of education, in terms of social and political questions around equity and justice. But also, I will say that we've built a small, but we really need to grow it, part of the podcast with people working in education. I've just found like 2 an episode. These are some of the most urgent episodes in thinking through the meaning of Black studies in 2025, 2026. So that's just a long way of saying welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really excited to get your voice as part of the series.
Yeah, I appreciate the work that you're doing, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this ongoing conversation.
And as I said, and just because I want to make sure when he listens to this, I acknowledge it, my son saw you give a talk and was completely galvanized by the kind of work you do and excited by that. So to my son, Miles, yes, I followed through. I promised I got one of your influences on the podcast.
Yeah, it's cool. And shout out to Miles for advocating for me to be here, and also the wonderful students down there at Morehouse who are doing excellent work around these questions of Black studies and education. So it's nice to see how the work is kind of branching out. But yeah, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think we got to get people from the center there on the podcast to here in the coming months. So. Well, we'll have a chance to talk about your work and how you think about the field of Black studies and all of that. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always this companion piece, which is what keeps you connected to and sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I feel like I've had, every time I get a question like that, it's hard to pinpoint the beginning for me personally, because even before I had the language of quote unquote Black studies, I was exposed to it in various parts of my life in terms of family and community. But so I'll start in the most direct way, which is, I was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley. When I went to Berkeley, I got to Berkeley as a freshman in 2006, and I was immediately kind of drawn to kind of Black student leaders and organizers on campus, a lot of Black student organizations, and it was a very strong culture of Black student organizing at Berkeley, and they all made it very clear for incoming freshmen that you all need to take African American studies courses, even if you're not an African American studies major. And they gave us a long list and a short list of faculty member of particular courses that we should think about. But I will, and so for my very first semester, I was enrolled in African American studies courses, even though I ultimately became a business major. But I'm pretty close. I don't know if I formally double majored in African American studies and business, but my undergrad transcript was very clearly split between finance, econ, stats, and then African American history, African American literature, the kind of upper division and lower division AFAM courses. But I will say that the one course that completely changed my trajectory was a course that I took with Professor Eula Taylor at UC Berkeley in my sophomore year. And it was a history survey course. It was African Americans in the Industrial Age is what the title of the course was. But she was just the most phenomenal lecturer and professor that I had over the course of my undergraduate experience, and the kinds of questions that I was exposed to, the way that my thinking was pushed in that particular course, the way that I came to see things about my own family, the community that I came from, and the history that we were studying, and the conversations in class, were just really transformative for me. And it was at a moment where I was really feeling alienated in the business program that I was at, that I was in there at Berkeley. And I felt like I was clearly developing as a thinker, as an intellectual, as a scholar in the African American studies courses that I was taking. And it was in stark contrast to me just essentially being trained to become something that I knew that I did not necessarily want to be, but I felt like I was doing something that I thought I had to do so that I could get a job after graduating. I was a first generation high school graduate and certainly first generation college student. And I was just kind of figuring my way out. But my professor, Eula Taylor, and then also Robert Allen, who was a professor in the African American Studies department at Berkeley, became really, really important mentors for me, and pushed me to consider like what it might mean to get a PhD after undergrad in something like history or African American studies. And they encouraged me to, they recommended me to the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program when it was first being established at Berkeley. So I was in the first cohort of the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program when they first branched out and added, UCLA and Berkeley as public schools to that undergrad fellowship, which is a pipeline program to diversify the professoriate. And I had no idea what professors did, but it was because of them pushing me, because of the way that I showed up in their classes, that really opened my eyes to a potential life and career as a scholar. And it was formally, that's an origin story for me. But then I have to say that they really built on something that was already a part of my own trajectory. So I'm from Compton, California, and I attended a small Black parochial school in Compton, California, from preschool through 8th grade. All Black students, all Black teachers. Majority of the teachers were Southern migrants who migrated to California and moved into Compton, after the kind of, Watts uprising, when you have a lot of white flight from, Compton and other parts of Los Angeles as well. But I attended, it was a small Episcopalian school right behind Compton High School. It was formerly all white, created for the white parishioners. But as white flight happened, a lot of Black folks kind of appropriated this school. And by the time I got there in the 1990s, all of the teachers and administrators were Black from the U.S. and also from parts of the diaspora. We had teachers from Black Afro-Panamanian teachers. Folks from Uganda was the headmaster. When I think about the headmaster of the school, I had a teacher from Kenya, and the majority of them also were formerly educated in the Jim Crow South. Every morning before class started, all of us students from preschool through 8th grade, we were lined up on the school grounds. We had to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing every morning, every day of my life from preschool through 8th grade. We had to recite poems by Black writers every morning of my life from preschool through 8th grade. And I thought that was normal. It wasn't something that was out of the norm, that we were told that, it wasn't just learning that for Black History Month, though our Black History Month celebrations were huge and big productions, but it was, the study of Black life and culture was an integral part of the academic life of the school that I attended. And I just didn't know that there was any other way. And so when I got to college was the first time that the majority of my teachers were not Black, because even the high school that I attended in Watts was a public high school, King Drew Magnet High School, but it was majority Black students, all the administrators were Black, and the majority of the teachers were also Black. And so our English and history courses were kind of, not explicitly Black studies courses, but we were absolutely reading
Mhm.
Black text in those classes. And so Black studies in college gave me a name for something that I had been experiencing all of my life. And I felt really drawn to it because that was always a part of my education and something that I understood to be important.
I love that the way you wrapped that up and you said it like gave a name or gave an expression for this thing that you had been experiencing. Um, and for me, I know, and for my colleague Ashley, collaborator Ashley, and I think for most listeners, like this first question is the most interesting. Just seeing how people arrive in Black studies and what those stories are, and one of the things you really underscored there was the everydayness of Black studies that has a formal dimension of a classroom, a department, a form of instruction, and
Hmm.
I love the way you brought that together, and that idea that it gives an expression to, or you know, um, draws together this 18 years of experience, or at least 13. I mean, kindergarten through 12. I
Yeah.
really like that. I also will say that Professor Taylor is on the podcast, really one of our most important episodes. And so always like to sort of refer into a podcast when relevant, but also just
Yeah.
it's good to hear her name. I mean, what a legend in the field for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you then. I mean, in this way, you've been Black Studies from the beginning in terms of your undergraduate work, but also, as you say, sort of,
Mm.
Black Studies as a kind of shape of educational life prior to that. I'm interested to hear you talk about what that portrait of Black Studies is for you. And I really always ask this in the context of its founding, which had a tension built into it. There was the commitment and demand that the students had at the founding of Black Studies for there to be a place where the Black intellectual tradition could be studied, developed, and interrogated, and so forth. And that traditional disciplines had not done this. And Black Studies departments were going to be and have really been where
Hmm.
that kind of commitment to an intellectual tradition finds its real foundation and root. And I think we inherit that today in a commitment in Black studies and a portrait of Black studies that's committed to that intellectual tradition. But of course,
Hmm.
that moment of founding is also the moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where some of these boundaries between a campus and a community, between a classroom and political mobilization, between prescriptive action and ideas, really get blurred and really contested. And I think we inherit that today in terms of the commitment in Black studies to a certain kind of politics. And I
Hmm.
never want to call that a contradiction, but it's definitely a tension, a commitment to a certain politics, and a commitment to the intellectual tradition. It's sort of couched in that context. Then, sort of, how do you imagine the field of Black studies? What orients you as an intellectual?
Yeah. You know, when um this question was really central for me when I was uh, a graduate student, when I was doing my doctorate work also at Berkeley. I had the benefit of Eula Taylor being the person who inspired me to pursue a PhD. And then
Mhm.
when I got into PhD programs, I ultimately decided that I wanted to stay at Berkeley and study ultimately under her and Robert Allen, where he retired before I kind of really got to my dissertation work, but Eula Taylor was my dissertation chair. Um, and I didn't go to graduate school to study questions about education, but I found my way to questions about the history of Black education because I actually had problems. I had some concerns with the kind of narration of the origins of Black studies. And I feel like I can talk about it in a much more pointed way now, especially in light of what I shared about my own how I came into the tradition, right? It began well before college, but I became really interested in the important intellectual and political legacy of African American teachers, school teachers,
Mm.
um, who did a lot of important intellectual work, institution building outside of the formal academy, that really, was a really important part of the kind of early Black studies movement, if you will, prior to Black folks getting major access to, elite universities in the late 60s, though Black studies was built at, at HBCUs and historically white institutions as well. But a lot of those folks were demanding formal space in the universities to incorporate a tradition they were demanding space for a tradition to continue to be studied and built upon that many of them knew existed because they had been exposed to it in other places, right?
Hmm.
And and we really learned this when we look at the biography of some of the people who were those early movers and shapers in demanding Black studies. Many of the students who were sitting in and taking over buildings. Some of them have been exposed to what not just Negro History Week in the schools that they came from. Right? I can think about this, for instance, someone like Hortense Spillers, right, when she talks about being a graduate student at Brandeis and taking over buildings, but she also is from Orange Mound, Tennessee. When she talks about her early exposure to Negro History Week celebrations, both in the churches that she attended, but also teachers that she had, reading Black newspapers, and some of the kind of passages from Carter G. Woodson's textbooks being reprinted in Black newspapers, her and her classmates having to memorize poems and speeches and delivering those things from writings by Black um, authors like James Weldon Johnson, and her reading God's Trombones as prior to going to college and things like that. Really, I became interested in the important work that Black teachers and Black educators had been doing over the course of generations outside of the formal academy to sustain this tradition
Mm.
that we came to call Black studies, when it was being demanded during the Black student movement in the late 1960s. Um, and so a lot of my work as a scholar in terms of reclaiming the institution building, the intellectual work, the writings of Black school teachers, people like Carter G. Woodson, who was a school teacher, even though he had a PhD, but many of the early writers in tech of the important foundational Black studies texts that will be reclaimed were people who were also teachers. Du Bois himself
Yeah.
being among that number, Anna Julia Cooper, right? And even if they were not teachers themselves, they were also people who were shaped by Black teachers in Jim Crow schools. Whether this be an Angela Davis, right, who talks about her early exposure to Black history attending schools in Birmingham, whether this be Zora Neale Hurston, right? And so for me, I've always been interested in thinking about this kind of prehistory to the kind of formal establishment of Black studies in the academy in the late 60s. And especially thinking about this earlier history of Black teachers and Black school and communities that's a part of that origin story. Because I think that's something that we've kind of come to lose sight of today, and thinking about Black studies primarily as a kind of a higher ed, university and college level kind of intellectual and political project, and participating in reinforcing this prosthetic boundary between K through 12 schools and higher ed in ways that I don't think has served our communities well.
That is fantastic. Look, this is also one of these. I mean, all these questions I really love hearing people's thoughts. But how people imagine the field of Black studies is always interesting. And this is, um, I mean, I've heard people on the series go in similar directions, but I love this. This is why education, right? Educational history, think about educational institutions and so forth, is so important for Black studies, because that was an amazing way to articulate the prehistory, as you said, of a thing that's also
Mhm.
its ongoing meaning. I mean, that prehistory that you talked about was also like your own history of coming to African American studies at Berkeley. So that was fantastic. Thank you. I love that. And let me ask in this way, I know these things fit together nicely. I want to ask you then about your own research. You've talked a good bit about it. You're interested in education history, race and power, freedom struggle, and there's so much for the field of Black studies inside these critical frames and the intersection of these interests. And I'm interested to hear you reflect a little bit about how your research and your interests fit in terms of the history of the field of Black studies, but also
Mhm.
what horizons you think it opens up and what boundaries you think it pushes.
Yeah, so I arrived to my research questions in a very kind of confused and puzzled way. It's not what I went to graduate school to study. Believe it or not, I initially planned. I wrote my undergrad thesis under Eula Taylor, about, questions of Black masculinity and the Million Man March. And I thought I wanted my dissertation to be a project of kind of Black masculinity and social movement history, and particularly thinking about the kind of historicizing the Million Man March. I had all kinds of questions about that particular historical event that I'd never, you know, you know, did anything with since I got to graduate school. But I came to this questions around education because I read this one book by a scholar named Vanessa Siddle Walker. She has it's a book called Their Highest Potential. And it's about a high achieving Black segregated school in Coswell County, North Carolina, where the, and it's a story about this. It's a historical ethnography of this high achieving Black school in rural North Carolina. And I read that book my first year as a doctoral student, and I was in a course on race and education policy or something like that. Um, and it was so surprising to me that I found so many similarities between my own educational experience at that school I told you about in Compton and this high achieving Black school in the Jim Crow South, geographically, in terms of the temporally, in terms of like the time period and stuff like that, couldn't not be further apart. And I was like, I found more resonance with that experience that she was writing about this Black school in the Jim Crow South in my education in Compton, than I did with the narratives that so many people expected me to be familiar with about the school to prison pipeline, the kind of disparity between Black teachers and Black students, the kind of culturally insensitive curriculum and stuff like that. And I never related to any of those experiences. When we read articles about those sort of things when I was in college, all my other Black classmates who were used to being the one high-achieving Black student in their class or in their schools coming from various parts of California. And I was like, this is weird. I was like, they didn't know anything. They didn't have Black teachers until they got to college. I was like, I have the least amount of Black teachers now than I've ever had in my entire life. It was a complete opposite for me. And then I started to realize that all of these teachers that I had, the principal of the school that I attended from preschool to 8th grade was a Black woman who grew up in a family of tenant farmers in Lake Providence, Louisiana. She went on to go to Southern University, started teaching at the Southern University Laboratory School before she migrated to California. My 3rd grade teacher is a Black woman from, North Carolina. There are folks from Alabama. There are folks from Arkansas that I had at teachers, many of them educated in the Jim Crow South, and they recreated the good parts of what they remembered from their educational experience in the schools that I had exposure to. And I started to realize, well, if they were building on something that was quote unquote good in their educational experience, that just didn't fit with the narratives that I had in my mind about Black education prior to Brown v. Board of Education, right? I thought that Black schools were separate, unequal, and nothing else because I hadn't been taught a narrative about the history of Black education prior to Brown that allowed me to have this nuanced and more complicated picture that, yes, Jim Crow was a terrible time, was an awful time, was a level of kind of structural violence and structural racism that's unimaginable to some of us living in the more contemporary times. But that didn't mean that Black folks didn't create good things despite those hostile, that hostile environment. And the teachers, it's like I started to raise questions. Well, how do we get all of these important leaders and scholars who were educated in these schools that went on to lead so many of these movements that we celebrate? Certainly, they didn't do these things on their own. And I started to become interested in the history of Black teachers who were doing important political work in the shadows of the civil rights, of the Black freedom struggle, in their classrooms, cultivating dreams in generations of Black people, right? That we had not been writing about and had not been telling that story. And in fact, had been telling the story that Black teachers were just apolitical. They were deferential to white Jim Crow school authorities. They were more concerned about not losing their jobs than pushing for desegregation because they thought that they would lose their jobs. And the scholarship had really overlooked what I came to understand as a very, very important part of the Black intellectual tradition, Black organizing tradition, and a really important set of movers and shapers in the Black freedom struggle, by not talking about the central role of educators in that story. And those are some of the things that I kind of came to try to push against the boundaries of, or to try to, pull to the center of the story and to ask some different questions, because the readings and stuff that I had when I was a PhD student in African American studies, there was very little that I got exposed to about the history of Black education, and certainly very little about the historic role that Black teachers played, even though they were the largest group of Black professionals for the greater part of the 20th century. And a central part of Black folks, especially Black women, right? In the intellectual labor of Black women, so many of them were teachers, right? And went into teaching. When we think about early 20th century Black women and Black women professionals and intellectuals and things like that. And that became a big part of that has been a big part of my work, is helping to tell a much more expansive, much more complicated and nuanced story about the political and intellectual life of Black teachers and their role in helping to sustain the tradition of what we now know as Black studies.
Thank you for that. That's extremely interesting, and that shift of I don't even know quite what the word would be. It's not really a shift of critical frame, but it's a real political shift from a sort of a frame of deficiency and injustice to like institution making, and not as survival, but as you said, I mean, somehow it produced this like massive numbers of transformative figures, and so
I love that. And if I could just elaborate on that, for me, because I didn't initially have that clarity at the beginning, right? When I first started out, I became interested in, I read The Miseducation of the Negro. I first read that book, when I was an undergrad. I was pledging a Black fraternity. It was required reading for us to kind of be considered for membership. But then I reread that text when I was also in Eula Taylor's class, and then also again it was on the reading list for the African American Studies required reading when I was a graduate student. But then I got to a place where then I started learning that he also wrote textbooks. And I was like, I had no clue that there were Black educators who wrote textbooks. I only knew about the kind of racist narratives that with the secondhand white school textbooks, the idea that there were Black teachers like Woodson. And then I came to learn even before Woodson, Lila Amos Pendleton, she was a Black woman teacher in Washington, D.C., the same time as Woodson, wrote a textbook. And then someone like Jessie Fawcett, who was the kind of, working with Du Bois with the Crisis magazine, wrote these beautiful reviews of her textbooks in the Crisis magazine that circulated all across the country. It was a very, very popular textbook before her. There was, there was also John, Cromwell, a public school teacher, Edward Johnson, a fugitive slave who became a teacher, James W.C. Pennington, the first Black person to author a textbook, right? Also a teacher. This long tradition of Black teachers writing textbooks. The Negro, the Negro in our history, a narrative of the Negro, right? All of these early Black history textbooks written by Black teachers. And I was like, this is not just a story of deficiency. This is a story of kind of robust intellectual struggle that teachers are at the center of. And this is a clearly early marker of Black studies when we start to look at the content. And it's not even just a kind of a U.S. focused narrative. All of these textbooks have a diasporic frame to them. Even the 19th century ones, right? They're all talking about questions around, histories of Africa. They're talking about questions around colonialism on the African continent. They're talking about maroon societies in Brazil and in the Caribbean as evidence of Black leadership, right? These are things that are in these textbooks in the early 20th century and late 19th century and things like that. And that became a really important window for me to start asking these questions. But then Carter G. Woodson became the central figure because he was a school teacher, second Black person to get a PhD in history, founded what we know as Black History Month, founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. But Carter G. Woodson was always very clear that the institutions he created was only sustainable because of Black teachers who helped fund the efforts of his institution building and his the expansion of Negro History Week. at a point when white philanthropists stopped funding the work that he was doing because they felt that he was too complicated of a figure to work with, right? And that it was Black teachers who helped to continue funding it, who were members of the organization that he created. We only get the early history of Negro History Week before it's a nationally recognized kind of holiday or commemorative practice in the 70s and then 80s, right? Because of Black teachers and ordinary community members sustaining this. And it's absolutely Black teachers who are helping to spread this tradition across the country, right? That's what helped me understand the power of their organizing.
Mhm.
It was through Carter G. Woodson. And what clear I don't know that we have a clearer marker of the early Black history story than the story of the early Negro history movement and Negro History Week, right? And Carter G. Woodson was very clear that it was the teachers that helped to kind of establish and to kind of spread and grow that tradition very early on.
I'm dead serious when I say these names that of these textbook writers and the titles of these textbooks need to be part of our everyday conversations
Yeah.
about Black studies. So
Mhm.
look, I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation so far, but you've completely convinced me that I have like a tragic gap in my understanding of even what I do on a daily basis for the last 25 years. So, which is great. This is exactly what conversations are supposed to do because, as you say, if they're diasporic in sensibility, if they're political, they're political by their very existence, right? And the fact that we don't know these names, but as you say, as you were saying, Woodson himself is embedded in this, and at that
Mhm.
point, I guess it's like a tradition rather than him being this sort
Mhm.
of singular figure. So
Absolutely.
I really love that. And so, following up a little bit then about your research, and I meant to mention this at the beginning. Part of why I was also excited to have you on the podcast is having people with PhDs in the field of Black studies is so important for this particular podcast and broadly speaking. But
Mhm.
you also have it as your undergraduate degree, and
Yeah.
it's part of your appointment now in African American studies. I know you're also in education.
Mhm.
And so when I look at this, it's interesting to me that you don't really have a passage through a discipline in terms of your college
Mhm.
graduate education and your appointment. I mean, education is a discipline, but still you're coming to it through Black studies. And
Yeah.
I want to I want to hear you reflect a little bit on how you think the sort of beginning to job, beginning to present journey inside of Black studies and that non-disciplinary character of it, how you think that has shaped how you conceive a research project, but also maybe
Mhm.
how it shapes how you conceive and practice classroom.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and um it was quite liberating to me to realize that I didn't have to start with a kind of a rigid commitment to a method and the reproduction of a particular discipline as a kind of as the parameters for the work that I had to set out to do, but that I could fully lean into the question
Mm,
that I understood to be important and pressing and to figure out what protocols, what methodological approaches would be best suited for helping me to kind of answer and to get at some understanding about that particular question that I was asking. Um, and to realize that I could read across a kind of a diverse body of work and literature, even if I had to kind of make some decisions when it came to thinking about what method was going to anchor the project,
mhm,
right? Because I do feel like at a certain point it became clear that history and historical methodology was going to be the method that really anchored the way that I went about answering my questions because the questions I was asking were historical in nature, even as they were informed by a lot of questions about the present moment around Black studies, around questions around education and Black social life. Um, that that didn't mean that I had to kind of um, that there were not resources in other, you know, disciplines and bodies of work that were important to me because I have to say African American literature was central to helping me think about the questions that I wanted to ask about Black education, right? For instance, like I can't like seeing the scenes of Black educational life in so many kind of Black novels really helped me to start to think about the like layered context of Black schools and Black school communities, right? In the Jim Crow South, whether this is, Cain by Gene Toomer, right? Having to read that particular text and thinking about the scenes of kind of uh, uh, you know uh, Black education in rural contexts in the South, whether it's thinking about the kind of that really, really important kind of graduation and commencement scene in the autobiography of an ex-colored man by James Weldon Johnson, who was a school principal when he wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, and who was the president of the kind of Florida Colored Teachers Association, right? And who attended a really, really important historic high school in Florida, and whose mother was a teacher as well, right? Just thinking about these traditions, the way the history of Black education shows up in the kind of Black cultural life and in the artifacts of Black cultural life from the past that became resources for me to think with as I was asking historical questions. Or Zora Neale Hurston writing about her own education experiences and dust tracks on the road. When I remember reading that scene when she's talking about her teacher having to navigate the kind of white gaze when these white women come and visit the classroom, and the students have to kind of perform in some ways to demonstrate their ability to read in front of these white visitors. But that was a really important moment for teaching me something about the sociology of Black educational life in this context, and the way Black folks had to navigate power in real time, that was really helpful for me in terms of going back and trying to revise the way that I talked about the complicated way that Black teachers as public employees had to navigate the constraints of Jim Crow, right? So being in Black studies and having to read Black literature, having to read, you know, poems, and having to read, sociological studies that Black folks had written about over time, and being able to borrow from those resources when it best suited the project that I was doing, that was historical in nature, but that allowed me to kind of get at things that were not always reflected in the archive, or that helped me see the limits of the archive in ways that I wanted to be mindful not to um normalize when writing about these things, but that allowed me to kind of ask questions about those things in my writing and to be a bit more careful. And so being in Black studies and not being in the kind of silo of history and being wedded to the reproduction of the discipline of history as it's currently constituted, was really freeing to me and allowed me to think outside of that, even as I can recognize the strengths of historical methods, or recognize the strengths of kind of close reading practices that a lot of Black literary scholars modeled, that allowed me to kind of engage with the archive in different ways, right? Reading Saidiya Hartman, and folks influenced by Saidiya Hartman as well, and bringing that to my approach to the archive. All of that was really, really generative for me. And it takes more time a bit, because you don't have a clear path, right? So sometimes it can be easy to kind of get a little lost sometimes,
Sure, sure.
in the kind of Black studies realm of things. But I usually think that when struggling through all of that and recognizing all of the gifts that we have at our disposal, I do think that the work comes out better on the other side, and I'm really
Mhm.
grateful for it. In the end.
That's beautifully put, and I like the, the struggle, and it can be messy or too, like the struggle to pull together once you widen the field of what an archive is,
Hmm.
a set of sources are, and how to get oriented in it. I mean, there's a reason why traditional disciplines are called disciplines, right? They discipline the material, but I think that you use that word
Yeah.
struggle, and there's so much learned. I found, and you were saying as well, there's so much to be learned from struggling through the too much, right?
Right.
Guided by a question rather than letting
Yeah.
the discipline having
Yeah.
shaped what the question can even ask, and how it
Yeah.
can see the material in front of you.
And on this point, there's an essay by Lewis Gordon that was really helpful to me, and that I teach in my Black Studies and Education Research course. It's called his essay about what he calls disciplinary decadence,
Yeah.
which thinking about questions around method in Black studies, that really kind of complicates this and help me understand a lot of what I just articulated is kind of really informed by my thinking and reading of that particular text, and thinking about my work as someone who does historical research as an interdisciplinary scholar trained in Black studies. It's really coming from that, but also the way that the African American Studies program that I was in was structured, that required us to read across fields before we got to a place of kind of like choosing our methodological orientation for our projects, even even if we were still anchored in a discipline in some primary way. Our primary field was always African American studies broadly. That was kind of, we might think of as like anti-disciplinary, right? But before you kind of like get to a place of choosing a rigid disciplinary orientation, there's this much more, not anti, but anti. Like before you kind of make these kind of commitments, there's this kind of shared knowledge that anyone in African American studies should be able to say something about traditions in African American literature and, Black studies in the social sciences, African American history, questions around diaspora, right? We should be able to speak about these things in a fundamental way, even if we go more in depth in our own area of specialization when it comes to our particular methods that we're primarily using, place and time and so on and so forth.
I love that. Yeah, nice. I'm glad you followed up. That was really insightful and precise. And I think you've probably already spoken to this next question, one of the last two I had for you. But I wanted to ask it, thinking about the field of Black studies historically, what do you think it has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I think the scholarship that has come out of Black studies has really transformed scholarship in the academy, I must say. There's no way of thinking thinking about even, the way that folks like Saidiya Hartman's work, the way that that Du Bois's work, the way that Hortense Spiller's work, and so many other folks, the way that the Black studies scholarship has not only transformed scholarship in the kind of field of Black studies, but also even in some of the traditional disciplines. Like you can't deny that. And I think that there's been so much creativity in the field that is just really, really impressive in what's been achieved in a very limited amount of time with a limited amount of resources. One of the things that I would say, I think it goes back to our earlier point. It's unfortunate that so much of that wonderful and important work that has happened at the top in kind of higher education has done, but has not really, as a scholar concerned with education and folks and the educational experience of folks before they get to the university classroom or college classroom, right? Much of that stuff has not really found its way into communities in the way that I think that Black studies originally intended for that work to be put into practice. Certainly there are some examples that kind of deviate from that, but I do think that as someone who's concerned about what happens in K through 12 classrooms and in communities and community education spaces, I haven't necessarily seen the pathway for that work to find its way into K through 12 classrooms and community education spaces in the ways that I think we really need. We have needed for a long period of time, and especially in this moment with attacks on, African American history and African American studies in higher education and in the K through 12 context, we're realizing the kind of that this attack has always happened on multiple fronts. There's a big need for that, the kind of constellation of Black studies that is a part of the origin story, where we have scholars like who doing work in the academy, very much so in partnership and collaboration with educators in schools and classrooms and communities, right? I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the way the kind of early formations of the tradition came to be. I think that's really instructive for some of the things that we haven't been doing and what we need to be doing in this current moment, right? So that's one of the areas for a lot of growth, for the present day and for the future. And I've felt that way for quite some time, to be honest.
And as you put it there too, it's always interesting to me, and I mean interesting in a very rich and broad way, when the sort of a chart of a path of the future is actually at the origin, right? Which is just what you said there. It's really
but I think you put it very, very succinct. I appreciate that, very succinctly, and a beautiful way of putting it. But yes, absolutely.
So the final question, maybe you've already spoken a bit to it across this conversation. In a Black Studies context, what is the one question you would want us to all be asking, or the one issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
The one question, I don't know that I have a meaningful response to that right now, because I feel like it's likely going to be a similar question to the one that I think I've been coming back to in terms of the broader, like, what is the broader educational vision of Black Studies, and where should that work be taking place? Because I don't think that it's just in the university and college classroom, right? I am always thinking about the developmental needs of young and emerging Black minds and Black learners, and that requires us thinking about the Black Studies Project outside of that context, and in the context of a much more expansive learning ecology that accounts for communities and classrooms, right, in K through 12 settings, in out of school learning environments, and in broader kind of community settings. And that's the big question for me, is that the intellectual and political work that we're doing in Black Studies is in service of what, ultimately, beyond the production of new, exciting, and creative scholarship. I would hope that it's about a kind of a much longer game of transforming the quality of life for Black folks everyday Black folks in communities, and the kind of broader social world that we're all a part of. And I think that is always the big question for me. So that larger educational question, like, where is the education supposed to be happening? Where is the kind of where is the kind of the real Black Studies classroom, that we should be thinking about? And I think it always is a question that, for me, goes back to young folks in community, many of whom, when I think about the majority of my family and the people that are always in the back of my mind when I'm writing, they're not the people that I run into and brush shoulders with in the university and in colleges. My folks back home that I'm constantly thinking about are not always in those places, and that they're always top of mind for me.
That's a wonderful place to wrap up. And, one of the things I think as a place of wrapping up that's so interesting is that in the context of everything you've been talking about, it's like the question that you want us to all be asking is not alongside of the very things we teach as the foundations of the field of Black Studies, but is embedded inside of those. And the way you've been able to articulate it across this, it's like you don't have to, we don't have to look outside of what we do for other things we should think about doing or find ways to do.
Yeah.
It's actually in the things we're doing. It's just look at them differently. And I've learned so much. And I mean, I'm going to go spend my afternoon thinking about this, because there's so much in this. And, that's this way of saying personally, and I know I speak on behalf of everybody who listens into this episode, I really appreciate your time. Of course, it's, late May, everybody's busy and exhausted, but really for your thoughtfulness and insight. This is a fantastic contribution to the series, and I just want to say that.
I appreciate that. And thanks for the thoughtful questions.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
Yep. You as well.